Hello. Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for getting up in time to come to this talk. I'm delighted to be here. I'm also delighted to have been invited by Ethan and the board of the MahlerFest, and I want to thank them so much for their really warm welcome and hospitality. Particularly Les and Deborah. Les obviously sadly can't be with us, but it's been a wonderful experience. But mostly I want to thank the board for putting on this amazing event. I mean, I've done a few conferences in my time, and I know how much work it takes. I've never done anything on this scale, but an enormous amount of hard work and organization goes into it. So I congratulate Ethan and Ken and the rest of the board for putting on such a successful event. And to do it year after year kind of blows my mind, really. So congratulations to everybody, and a very warm welcome. So yes, I'm Jeremy Barham, and I'm going to be talking about the main work, I suppose, Mahler work that's being performed in the festival, which is the Fourth Symphony. How can we best understand this symphony? It's music of heaven, right?
Heaven, I'm in heaven, and the
Both of those pieces obsessed with the what's called the 6/5 appoggiatura. Da-dum. And if you're not convinced,
seem to vanish like a gambler's lucky streak when we're out together.
now I don't know whether Irving Berlin heard the Fourth Symphony. He would well have, actually, because it was first performed in New York in 1904. But someone ought to look into that if you haven't already. Get onto it, yeah. I want to backtrack a little bit to see how Mahler got to the stage he was at when he composed the Fourth Symphony, because I think we need to understand a little bit of the background in order to understand the work. First thing I want to focus on is the folk influence. It's well known that Mahler was hugely interested in folk music. Where did this come from? Well, there are accounts of his early years. Oh, by the way, before I carry on, I meant to say right at the beginning, there are a couple of slides with quite detailed visuals, bits of score. I can tell you that you probably won't be able to see the detail if you're further back than about the second row. So if anybody wants to move up, don't be shy, do it now. That's what I recommend. They come a little bit later. Anyway, so there are accounts from letters that Mahler wrote, or his friends wrote, about his interest in the countryside of his birthplace around the Sprachinsel, or language island of Iglau, which is on the Bohemian-Moravian border. Fritz Lohr wrote about their experiences wandering around the countryside, where authentic Bohemian musicians set lads and lasses dancing in the open air. There was the zest of life and sorrow too, and this is crucial. The archaically earthy charms of nature and of nature's children, which Mahler came to know in his youth, prepared the ground for his creative work and never ceased to vitalize his art. And this is just one of many reports about how Mahler's music was inspired, impelled creatively by the music of the people. So that might be called his lowbrow musical environment. He learnt the accordion from about the age of 5. He learnt Czech folk songs on it. He heard military music from the barracks in Iglau and local folk bands in his father's inn. But of course the flip side is his highbrow musical education, learning classical piano, playing all the core Austro-German works by Beethoven, some Schubert, Schumann, Chopin, Liszt. He briefly sang in a Catholic church choir, occasionally heard cantor music at the synagogue, and of course he studied at the Vienna Conservatoire. But throughout his life, there was this duality, I believe, between what we would call lowbrow and what we would call highbrow, but I'm not sure he saw it in those terms. I want to take us on a journey. So this slide is taking us on a journey of Mahler's conducting appointments in Europe and linking them with the music that he composes at different stages of his life. So this is an old map of Europe which shows the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the German Empire. So he started in some backwater places like Bad Hal-Laibach, which is Ljubljana, obviously not a backwater now, with provincial theatres, quite lowly theatres in the 1880s. And then he got his first sort of middling-sized job at Kassel. Then he went to Prague, then he went to Leipzig. Notice that he didn't stay very long in these places. Mahler was quite a demanding person to work with, and often he fell out with the people he was working for, and then moved on. And then his first symphony was composed while he was in Leipzig. Then he moved to Budapest, which is his first big national appointment at the Royal Hungarian Opera, 1888 to 91. He didn't do any composing during that time. And then he moved further north to Hamburg for 6 years, where he wrote his second and third symphonies, and crucially for us, the song Das himmlische Leben. His conducting duties at Hamburg were enormous. I mean, if you look at the list of pieces he conducted, it is crazy. So how he found time to compose is difficult to know, but of course he was known as the summer composer, and in fact, those works were largely written at his summer retreat in a composing hut in Steinbach am Attersee in the Salzkammergut in Upper Austria, which looks like that. And those mountains in the background are the Höhlengebirge, a stunning backdrop to his, where he was staying. And the top picture is his little composing hut, which is on the shores of the lake. When I went to visit it many years ago, I had to tiptoe between all the beach towels to get there, which is quite amusing. But it's preserved quite nicely inside. So another duality in Mahler's composing and creative persona and life is the urban versus rural dichotomy. So when he was conducting in a big metropolis, fairly big metropolis like Hamburg, he had his conducting duties, which he often complained about. And then he spent his summer retreats in rural areas, some kind of creative idyll, which enabled him to get on with composing. So after Hamburg, he went to Vienna, which was the most prestigious job in Europe. And there, he composed, while he was there, he composed his Fourth Symphony. And most of that work was done, well, it was finished in Meinig on the Wörthersee in Carinthia. And that's his house that he had built on the shores of the lake. And that was the composing hut that he had built up a little path in the woods behind. And that's also, well, you can visit it, I'm sure many of you have. I remember when I visited it, the guy inside was playing some, I think Led Zeppelin or something on his radio, and as soon as he saw me, he turned it off and switched to Mahler, which is very nice of him. From Meinig, he would visit the Dolomites every summer. That's the Dreisinnen, which I was lucky enough to visit for the first time for the second time last summer, but I did a bigger walk this time. And those are incredible, huge monuments of rock. And I'm sure if any of you have been there, you'll know how impressive they are. And that's Lake Misurina nearby, which Mahler was very fond of walking around. And those are my own photographs, by the way. Pretty good, aren't they? You know, almost professional standard. So that's where he finished the Fourth Symphony, well, in Meinig, with these excursions to spectacular mountain landscapes. And of course, then he went to the USA in 1907. But I won't be talking about that today. So back to the Fourth Symphony. Nobody composes in a vacuum, or very few people do. So what was his heritage when he came to write symphonies? Obviously, the great classical composers, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, and Schubert. Early romantics like Mendelssohn and Schumann. Slightly later romantics, Brahms and Bruckner, also Tchaikovsky and Dvorak. But also someone like Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, the archetypal programmatic symphony, and also Liszt's symphonic poems, which were often built around or reflecting or illustrating some kind of extra musical story, image, figure, were very important. He had ambivalent views on those two composers. At one point, he was very critical of them. At another point, he accepted that what they did was introduce lots of new techniques into symphonic writing. And then, of course, there's Wagner. And in 1896, just before he started work on the Fourth Symphony, he said, "Wagner has made symphonic music's means of expression his own, just as in turn the symphonic composer with complete justification and awareness will encroach on the expressive capabilities that music has gained through Wagner's efforts." So it's a bit of a wordy way of saying that Wagner got some tremendous influence from symphonic writers and incorporated that into his operas or music dramas. And in turn, Mahler took Wagner's dramatic techniques from the stage, which he conducted endlessly. For example, he conducted Tristan over 70 times during his career. He took those techniques and transplanted them into the symphony. So I came up with this kind of, I don't know whether it makes much sense, a sort of diagram of going from the 1700s up to the early 1900s. So the idea of drama, combining that with instrumental music, leads to the Beethovenian dramatic symphony at the end of the 1700s, early 1800s. And then if you combine that with literary and visual arts, that leads you to the Lisztian symphonic poem. And then if you combine that with the progressive theatrical idea, you get Wagnerian music drama. And then with all of that legacy, along comes Mahler's idea of revitalizing the symphony to incorporate all of these things, including sung texts, of course, using the model of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And so what I see happening is that based on all of this legacy of symphonic writing and also theatrical and dramatic stage works, Mahler created what I call an Über-symphony, which is not just instrumental necessarily, but included sung text, as I said, or at least adaptations, instrumental adaptations of songs. And that's what makes Mahler's music so interesting. It's very eclectic, and it's got all these strands combined into the Über-symphony, as I call it. And if you look at this, you don't necessarily need to look at all the detail, but the link between song and symphony is so strong in the works up to 1900, including the Fourth Symphony. So what I've got here, I've listed the first four symphonies on the left. And on the right, I've indicated where actual songs are included. So that's in green. I'm sorry if you're red-green colorblind. And in red, there are cases where he adapts a song or melody of a song, but doesn't include the text. So every symphony, all of the first four symphonies, use either or both adaptations of his own songs or actual songs that he wrote, including the sung text. And you'll see at the bottom there with the Fourth Symphony, the Das himmlische Leben, final movement, which was actually composed long before in 1892 as part of the collection from Des Knaben Wunderhorn, which he then extracted and decided to use as the finale of the Fourth Symphony. So the lyrical impulse of singing and vocal music was incredibly important to Mahler in the world of the symphony. He's known as the song symphonist in some circles, and in fact, Das Lied von der Erde is usually called a song symphony. Okay, so thinking about Mahler's legacy, what did he bequeath to future generations, just briefly? And again, I've got this sort of diagram, but I've divided it up into different categories. I'm only interested really in one of them today. One is neoclassicism, and I think the Fourth Symphony is an example of a kind of neoclassicism because it looks backwards to earlier forms of music and revitalizes them and adapts them in different ways. But and there are other aspects: expressionism, exoticism, pluralism, postmodernism, experimentalism. But we can leave those aside for just for the moment. So I think this neoclassical thing, or historicism, it's sometimes called, when any artist is looking to the past for inspiration, different historical movements, styles, techniques, and then adapting them for their own time, often called historicism. And it doesn't just apply to music, it applies to architecture. So this is a composite picture of part of the Ringstrasse in Vienna, which was completed in 1865. So that when Mahler went to Vienna, arrived in Vienna in the mid-1870s, this was all new. It doesn't look new now, but it was. So what we've got on the left is a Hellenistic or classic, almost ancient Greek-style parliament building. You've got a neo-Gothic city hall in the middle there. And on the right, you've got an Italian Renaissance-style building for the university. So architecturally, Vienna was very eclectic, and it was calling on all sorts of older architectural styles. And I think we can extrapolate a little bit. We can't go too far, but we can extrapolate a little bit into Mahler's mindset in adapting that kind of approach to composition. And the Fourth Symphony, it seems to me, is a perfect example of that. The other thing to think about is Jugendstil, or Art Nouveau, which was obviously in vogue in the late 19th, early 20th century Vienna. And Art Nouveau, or Jugendstil, or youth style, or young style, was really based on the idea of classic shapes, but adorned with very florid decoration. So here we've got a dining room. What a dining room that is. I'd love to have that. Designed by Joseph Hoffmann, who was a contemporary of Mahler, in 1905. And the actual geometric shapes of the furniture are quite traditional, but the decoration is extraordinary. So those decorations transform the shapes, to my mind. It's a really transformational exercise. Another example might be Otto Wagner's Majolika house in Vienna, built in 1899, which on the surface looks like a very kind of ordered classical type of building with regular shaped windows and floors. But the surface decoration is remarkable, absolutely beautiful. And it's not just surface, though. I think this decoration actually has an impact on the actual substance of the building. And that was what I think these secessionist and Art Nouveau, Jugendstil artists were all about, really. Adolf Loos was another major figure in the world of architecture and the plastic arts. And he came up with this phrase that I think we can apply to Mahler very strongly. One would do modern art a great favor if one used old forms in a new spirit. And thinking about the Fourth Symphony, that's exactly what Mahler does, particularly in the first movement. And I have to say, I'm going to focus mostly on the first movement. I'll mention a little bit about the other movements, but mostly the first movement. So, on to Mahler. We're sort of going from the broad to the more specific. This is an early plan for the Fourth Symphony, which was devised at the time he was composing the Third Symphony. It's a six-movement plan, but obviously that's not how the Fourth Symphony ended up. But there are things in this plan which are retained. I think that the first movement, The World as Eternal Present in G major, suggests to me the first movement of the Fourth Symphony. The earthly life is obviously Das irdische Leben, the song which didn't appear in the Fourth Symphony. Caritas, or charity, not sure about. That actually relates to much later, to the Eighth Symphony possibly. The Morning Bells appeared in the Third Symphony, the bim-bam movement of the Third Symphony. The World Without Heaviness is a difficult one. Some people have said that that might be a reflection of the first movement, or it might even be looking ahead to the scherzo of the Fifth Symphony. But of course, number 6 is The Heavenly Life, which was retained, Das himmlische Leben. So some things were retained, some things are ambiguous, some things perhaps made their way into other symphonies in this early plan. So let's think about the symphony. There's certainly in the first movement a reversion to classical elements, which I describe as neoclassical question mark. The other thing that happens is there are lots of quotations and allusions, and we're going to hear more about that from Joseph in a moment. And I would say that's an example of historicism, perhaps, of quoting or alluding very strongly to earlier music. I mean, all composers do this, I think, at some level. But the proliferation of quotations and allusions in the first movement is absolutely extraordinary. The other thing he does is he plays around with structures and forms that were developed, I suppose, during the classical period, particularly sonata form. So here's the outline of the Fourth Symphony, 4 movements, and the keys and their titles, and the tempo markings or the descriptions translated, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Don't need to dwell on that too long. Now, a lot of ink has been spilt about this influence of classical, 18th century classical composers on the Fourth Symphony. Everybody writes about this. It struck me that nobody's really thought what anniversaries, what important commemorations of classical composers happened during Mahler's career. And that's what I came up with. Now, not all of these were treated importantly. I mean, the biggest one was probably the 1906 150th anniversary of Mozart's birth. That was a big celebration. But there were others, and there must have been something in the air, in the cultural air. For example, in 1870, the 100th anniversary of Beethoven's birth. Let's say 1891, 100th anniversary of Mozart's death. There must have been something, some kind of commemorative activity, whether that be small concerts series or discussions in the press or whatever. So there was a lot going on, a lot of commemorations possibly going on, and there's evidence particularly of the 1906 anniversary of Mozart's birth. This is apocryphal, but apparently on his deathbed, the last word Mahler uttered was Mozart. Now, I have no idea whether this is true or not. I think it's probably in Alma Mahler's memoirs somewhere. And, well, we know that some of that is not exactly accurate, but some of it is, some of it isn't. So, you make of that what you will. Okay, people talk about these allusions, but what are they? Can we actually hear what these might be? So I've divided them into different categories. There are things which are like stock phrases that classical composers would use, stock ideas that many classical composers of the 18th century would use. There are references to particular sounds in the orchestration and little techniques. So I start with those, and then I'm going to go on to actual melodies, which may or may not have been quoted or consciously quoted or alluded to by Mahler. So let's start. There are quite a few very short music examples. This is the first one. Which obviously has the sleigh bells. Probably the most famous piece that used sleigh bells in the 18th century. Along comes Mahler and does his usual thing. He twists it. First of all, it's in an uncertain key. It sounds a bit like B minor, even though the movement's in G major. It's been described by Mahler as the jingle of the fool's cap. So there's something deeply ironic about that. So he's taken a straightforward jingle bell type of aesthetic and then twisted it in a typical Mahlerian way. That's a very specific example. Something that abounds in many Viennese classical works is the chromatica poggiatura, which you'll hear plenty of examples of in this piece, by this symphony by Mozart. That's a typical Viennese kind of decorative gesture. And of course, it's everywhere in the first movement of the Fourth Symphony. So, I'm not saying that it's difficult to say he kind of stole it, because all composers use these ideas, but he's using it so frequently in the first movement of the fourth that I'm convinced that it's some kind of homage to his classical forebears. And then some little stock melodic ideas, and this is an interesting one for me. And in early symphony by Mozart, there's this descending weeping idea, I call it. So it's an appoggiatura decorated with a trill, and this is what it sounds like. And this, I think, is a little bit more specific. And it comes again. And here's Mahler using the exact same idea, but in a slightly different way, slightly different setting, in the first movement of the fourth. And also, in the development section, with a different twist to it. Okay, so I don't have any evidence that Mahler knew that particular Mozart symphony, but it wouldn't surprise me. But there are other composers who use similar ideas. But again, the frequency with which it's used suggests to me that something is going on, something important is going on. Okay, so those are stock and general ideas. What about specific melodies? There have been suggestions that Mahler borrowed specific melodies from certain works. And I think, Joseph, you're going to talk about this a little bit later as well, particularly with Schubert. This is, well, you can make of it what you wish. I'll leave you to decide. And I think the reason we're playing these examples is actually to give you the opportunity to decide how much you think this borrowing is close, or whether it's just like a general approach to classical gestures, you know, whether there's actual borrowing or quoting going on. This is a little melody from Schubert Piano Sonata in E flat. Which seems to be strikingly similar to this. This is another Schubert Sonata, number 17 in D. Okay, that was so short, I'm going to play it again. The same idea, but slowed down. Mahler's piano teacher, as it says there at the Vienna Conservatoire, Julius Epstein, had edited the Schubert piano sonatas, and Mahler definitely played some of the sonatas there. Here's a Beethoven piano sonata in number 13 in E flat. And the fourth theme from the first movement of the fourth. Sorry. And this one was actually acknowledged by Mahler. He sometimes found it annoying that he had unconsciously borrowed from a composer. Sometimes, it was mostly he was annoyed about it. Sometimes he wasn't, though. And that was generally speaking when he found he'd borrowed from a folk song or of a folk composition. Anyway, here's an excerpt from the Fourth Piano Concerto of Beethoven. Personally, I don't see what he was worried about, but this is an interesting one. It's the Dance of the Bayadère from Act 2 of Oberon, which is an opera by Weber that Mahler did conduct. Quite a distinctive dance. And finally, Beethoven's Fidelio. Now, the beginning of the quartet in Act 1 of Fidelio, and this again is an opera that Mahler conducted so many times, and was one at the top of the list of his favorite operas for performing. There's a little introduction on the strings. Sorry, that should say Marcellina. Sorry, there's a Z missing. How appalling. My standards are dropping. Sorry about that. It precedes the Marceline singing of how she imagines herself and Fidelio having a happy future relationship, even though Fidelio is Leonora in disguise. I mean, you couldn't make it up, could you? But it begins like this. Okay, and here's the beginning of the third movement of the Fourth Symphony. Okay, so I don't play these examples to in any way undermine Mahler as a composer. Quite the opposite. He was known for borrowing or making allusions, not just in the Fourth Symphony, but in many of his works. And a lot of critics of the time had a very negative response to that, because in the 19th century, there was such an emphasis placed on originality. And of course, originality is virtually impossible because nothing comes from a vacuum. But the thing about Mahler's borrowings was that they were so overt, they were so obvious. And that's what the critics objected to. But who needs critics? I mean, my favorite phrase of Mahler's is, you know you're in the saddle when the dogs start barking. And that was his approach to critics. And, you know, who cares what they say? So I find this very interesting, and it's one of the reasons why Mahler has been allied with this mystical term postmodernism, because postmodernism is often built on borrowing of styles in various art forms. So whatever you think about that, you can all have your own opinions. In my opinion, Mahler created some incredible music, combining allusions to existing pieces of music, but adapting them. That was his creative power, really, to adapt them in unique ways, in ways that nobody else had done before. And he wasn't ashamed of calling upon other music, alluding or even sometimes borrowing what might be an exact little bit of melody. And he acknowledges that he did that. Okay, so I'll leave you to think about that for a moment, and then move on to, now we're going to go sort of a bit more into detail, just briefly, into a couple of passages in the first movement. This opening theme of the first movement is just packed with detail. Extraordinary amount of detail. But before I play it, and I've got some annotations, as you'll see in a moment. Oops, sorry. I just want to play you a little extract from, some of you may know that some orchestral players who played under Mahler in New York were recorded making reminiscences of their experience of Mahler as a conductor. And William Mallinson put all of these together into a recording. And there's a very interesting remark by a player I don't know the name of. Somebody may know. I assume a string player, who talks about the style in which Mahler wanted this particular melody to be played. So this should be coming up to it.
But you know, that was something here. If you do your duty and do it well and do it with your heart, he has nothing against you.
He wasn't too happy with the Philharmonic Orchestra. He'd fly off the handle very often. No, that is not the way to play it. He says, in New York, they play different. It's different in my ears. I hear different sounds of what I'm accustomed to, you know. He thought he was conducting the Vienna Orchestra or something.
Well, that brings me to something that I could never understand. But, you know, he's a Viennese. And, you know, Strauss and all that. His Fourth Symphony, his theme is da 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 ti da. My God, he asked all the first violins to do da 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 doi.
Aha.
That. I remember that.
Mm-hmm.
He insisted on certain slides in his music. Sometimes in a slow movement. In other composers, he would too. For instance, he said you couldn't go da. Nobody sings like that. So you have to slide to get there. Da, he would sing that.
Extraordinary. So they're talking about what's called portamento in string playing, sliding from one note to another. It's not a glissando. It's perhaps less overt than a glissando. Portamenti in string playing has gone out of fashion big time. Probably since, I mean, I don't know for sure, probably the 1930s, 40s, it went out of fashion. I have various theories about why it did, but excessive sliding was much more, well, no, not excessive. Sliding was much more common in Mahler's time. And if you listen to old recordings of Mahler symphonies, there's a lot of portamenti. And to our modern ears, it somehow seems too much, way too much. It's too saccharine, it's too sentimental. My own theory is that Hollywood is to blame for that. And once those excessive portamenti got caricatured in various ways in Hollywood, early Hollywood films, including cartoons. I mean, there's a great cartoon of Mickey Mouse playing the violin, and he's playing Schumann's Träumerei with unbelievably exaggerated portamenti. And I think that contributed to the demise of the portamento. Anyway, the slide. But let's just look at this theme. There's so much in it. First of all, there are 3 different performance instructions in words. There's grazioso, which we all know, gracefully. There's etwas zurückhaltend, somewhat held back, in the 3 upbeat notes. There's recht gemächlich and Haupttempo, quite leisurely main tempo. So just in the space of 2 bars, there's a lot going on in terms of performance instructions. The dynamics, I mean, there's P with a crescendo, going to PP, and then espressivo in the next bar. There's the slide, which with that little line between the F sharp and the G. There's articulation going on. There's a rest and a staccato. Mahler was absolutely fastidious about articulation. He didn't want to leave it to orchestral players and other conductors. He wanted to be absolutely explicit. So he puts that little rest in between the 2 Bs in the second bar to make sure there's a gap and a staccato mark. There's a lovely little turn figure. I could say a lot about the turn figure because it's such an important part. Ya-da-da-dum occurs in so many Mahler symphonies, particularly the 9th. There's your appoggiatura, the D sharp to the E. Little accents marked at various points. There's another inverted turn there, and a decorated cadential figure. Da-da-da-da-da-dum. That little mordant is so important. We have very detailed, precise phrasing throughout this little melody. So nothing is left to chance. Look at the melodic contour. Thinking of the melody and the pitches is really interesting. Given we're in Boulder, mountains and all that, you've got a very steep first phrase. You've got a slightly less steep one with a more of a dip at the end, rapid dip at the end. And then you've got a smaller, a hillock, maybe we could call it, in the last phrase. So there's balance, big, medium, small in terms of the up and down pitch arc, let's say. And this, to me, is the epitome of Mahler's dedication to detail and his obsessive regard for expression in music. It was so important to him. But not only that, I put symphony becomes symphony in inverted commas. It's as if this is a symphony about the symphony. Adorno is a German writer who wrote this very complex book, let's say, on Mahler. Talks about the Fourth Symphony as beginning once upon a time there was a symphony. And it's as if it's this kind of recall of an imaginary past that's going on in this work. So let's just hear that melody. I mean, there's so much in it, it goes past very quickly. And it's gone. But so much detail, incredible. So it's a real challenge for conductors, it's a challenge for performers. There was a little slide there, wasn't there? Not as exaggerated as the guy describing Mahler's slides, but there was a little slide. And I think tasteful slides are still present in performances of this type of music. But the exaggerated ones have gone. There are recordings conducted by Bruno Walter and also Willem Mengelberg of various works Mengelberg's recorded in the 1920s. If you get a chance to listen to them, they're really interesting because there are slides all over the place. And also, not much vibrato. When portamento disappeared, vibrato increased. It's like the balance of the scales changed. So in Mahler's day, there was much less vibrato string playing, apparently. And, or it was reserved just for special occasions. All right, now this was the detailed slide that people who are behind the second row won't be able to see, so I apologize for that. But I just wanted to mention, how am I doing for time? Just to check. Okay, coming to the end. There's a wonderful moment in the first movement of the Fourth Symphony where the so-called recapitulation begins. So if you don't know about sonata form, the standard model is exposition, development, and then a return to the material of the exposition, usually called the recapitulation, or other people have different terms for it. But for Mahler and other composers of this period, the moment of recapitulation was a crucial moment. How to deal with it, because Mahler hated straightforward repetition. He always adapted things. He felt that a repetition was somehow redundant. So this moment of recapitulation became a challenge for Mahler, in all his symphonies, how to do that. And particularly in this, as he's writing in a more classical style, what did he do? So I'm going to point out a few things and then just play this passage. I'm afraid there's lots of annotations. It's a bit like a kind of, a war map or something. But so first of all, there's a little anticipation of the Fifth Symphony here. Ba-ba-ba-bam, ba-ba-ba-bam, ba-ba-ba-bam. The opening fanfare of the Fifth Symphony appears here in two different trumpet parts. That's one thing interesting to point out. So this is the end of the development section. The development section is crazy. It's got so much going on. It's full of different themes, little snippets, little excerpts, it's kaleidoscopic in nature. And it's in F sharp minor. If you look here, we've got da 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 bi ba, but it's the main theme, but it started on the wrong note. It started on an F sharp instead of a D. So it doesn't sound right. And also it's come in too early because it's way before the actual point of recapitulation. So he's really messing us around here in the strings there. And it's expanded from within with this long-held B. So the recapitulation has seeped back into the development. It's extraordinarily clever. And then right at the last moment, we're nowhere near G major, the tonic key. And usually the recapitulation is when you go back to the tonic key. And he leaves it till right at the last minute, the last 2 bars. So it's very sudden, this move towards G. And you've got these little bits of imitation going on comically between the clarinets and the bassoons. And then there's a pause, it just stops, mid-phrase, like a joke. And the recap begins not with the beginning of the main theme, but the end of it. So we get the last 2 bars, dum pa pum pa 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 da da dum. So everything is twisted, everything is out of order, misaligned. And even the final thing is we don't get a cadence into G until after that point. So, okay, he's messing with all of the conventions of the sonata form moment of recapitulation. It's an incredible thing. Again, it passes very quickly, but it's jam-packed with amazing detail. And this is what it sounds like. So we're here. Here's the theme. I'm all in favor of a long pause. That pause is quite short. But I think that was a bardo, so I can't criticize, because he's my favorite Mahler conductor. So, once upon a time, is all that has happened in this first movement true? This is the end of the first movement. So, oops, I didn't mean that as an extra percussive gong strike. Mahler's endings actually are so interesting, and that's like a sort of joke ending. It's as if the whole thing's been a fantasy, and I think that's perhaps was what was in his mind. Very briefly, because I'm coming to the end of my time, I noticed in the program notes that there was a reference to this famous painting by Arnold Böcklin, a self-portrait from 1872. Which Mahler was very interested in Böcklin. And the second movement of the Fourth Symphony has that very spooky, ghost-like atmosphere. And it could well have been influenced by this very eerie painting with the skeletal devil playing the fiddle behind Arnold Böcklin, who's, I don't know, he looks a little bit bemused. I'm not sure he's aware that the skeleton is behind him. That could have been an influence on the second movement. And then another influence might have been Hans Holbein's series of woodcuts. And this is a very macabre one, where the skeleton is leading the little child out of the room. Obviously, the child has died. So that's that. Very briefly, just to indicate, to show how Mahler indicates certain things in the score of the second movement. This is how he wants the second of the 2 violins that the violin player has to be tuned a tone higher. It's called scordatura, which creates this very tense, rather sour sounding sound on the instrument. And then also he says that the solo violinist has to have 2 instruments at their disposal, one of them tuned a whole tone higher. And he also instructs the violinist to play wie ein Fiedel, like a street violin, a street fiddle. So there's 2 things going on. There's kind of the devil fiddle, and there's also the rustic street fiddle going on. Both of those combine in this very eerie movement, which Mahler described as like full of cobwebs, little strands of music which come together to create a whole, but they're like little filigree elements. But I haven't got time to say much more about that. One thing I do want to tell you about, though, is Mahler was very keen for people to know that there were thematic links between each movement of the symphony. And he wrote to one critic saying, you've forgotten, or you haven't noticed that there are actually very strong thematic links. So I'm just going to leave you with this example of, first of all, three excerpts, one from the first movement, one from the third movement, and one from the very beginning of the fourth movement, to illustrate these thematic links, let's say, between the movements, which, if you know the symphony well, you'll be aware of. If you don't know it so well, they're difficult to pick up on. Not necessarily easy to pick up on. So the first of them is what Adorno calls the dream ocarina moment, where there are 4 flutes playing in unison, this childlike whistling theme in the first movement. Okay, you've got that in your mind. At the end of the slow movement, there's this amazing outburst of E major, which comes out of nowhere. And during this outburst, towards the end of the movement, we hear that same theme, but now blasted out on the horns. So it's an adaptation of that ya-da-da-da-dee, that theme. And here is that moment in the third movement. Oh, and before I play it, the horns also play, they anticipate the first theme of the final movement, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, that bit. So there are 2 things going on in this outburst in the third movement. And this is the very beginning of the final movement, where you'll hear that little arpeggio. So I spoke over it. I do apologize. I'm going to start that again. And the voice has it too. Okay, so there are many other examples of shared themes between the movements, but it allows Mahler to, well, it's a device really for making the symphony more cohesive. I think I'll probably stop there because I've run out of time, I think. Obviously, one could talk endlessly about the Fourth Symphony, but time is against us. Thank you so much for listening, and if you have any questions, I'll be very happy to try and answer them. I think there's a microphone somewhere. Thank you.
Thank you. I've always wondered about the ending of the
Yeah. So after that outburst, and okay, first of all, I think keys are very important in this piece. It starts in G major and it ends in E major. Those two keys are very important to Mahler and in the structure of the whole movement, the whole symphony. So that outburst comes out of a G major passage and it suddenly goes to E major. They're not related very closely, those two keys. And the whole symphony ends in that key, E major, which is, I think, a symbol of transcendence. So that passage at the end of the third movement, I think, is some depiction of a transition to a state of transcendence, to a shift to another world or a higher world. He talks about how the image of the child is a kind of transformation or a link between this world and the next. The sad thing is, presumably it's a dead child, because why else would they be in heaven? So there's a kind of, although it's blissful and heavenly and transcendent, again, there is a kind of darker undertone. But at the end of that movement, after that outburst, it all calms down completely, and we get these very shimmering, untethered chords that don't have any root, very high up in the strings. So it's like just floating away into the atmosphere. And the movement actually ends, it's open-ended, it ends on the dominant, and we only get to the tonic G major at the beginning of the final movement. So that's a key moment, you're absolutely right, a key moment of transition. As to what it's a transition from and to, I mean, that's up to you to interpret, but the basic interpretation will be from this world to the next world, whatever you want to believe that to be. I do want to just, if there are no questions while you're thinking, one final thing actually, because this to me is quite interesting, if I have time. When Mahler was 19 or 18 or 19, he used to write these very florid romantic letters to his friends. One summer, in 1879, he wrote this to a friend called Joseph Steiner, when he was working on in the summer on a farm estate, teaching the farmer's daughter's piano, and then I think playing music for the farmer, basically. And I don't think he was very happy. Wildly I wrench at the bonds that chain me to the loathsome, insipid swamp of this life. And with all the strength of despair, I cling to sorrow, my only consolation. Then, all at once, the sun smiles upon me, and gone is the ice that encased my heart. Again, I see the blue sky, and the flowers swaying in the wind, and my mocking laughter dissolves in tears of love. Then I needs must love this world with all its deceit and frivolity and its eternal laughter. I think there's some little clue as to what the Fourth Symphony would go on to express in that. And this little passage from the same letter is even more telling, I think. A cascade of smoke from Melion, who is a spiritual figure in the form of the old local schoolmaster, covers the whole scene. The clouds become even denser. And then suddenly, as in Raphael's painting of the Madonna, a little angel's head peers out from among these clouds. And below him, Ahasuerus, the wandering Jew, stands in all his sufferings, longing to ascend to him, to enter the presence of all that means bliss and redemption. But the angel floats away on high, laughing, and vanishes, and Ahasuerus gazes after him in immeasurable grief. So there's imagery that, to me, is very closely related to the Fourth Symphony. And my final point will be this. Ernst Bloch, not Ernest Bloch, the composer, but Ernst Bloch, the philosopher, wrote a book called The Principle of Hope. Gosh, it took him 9 years to write. Wow, that's quite a long time. But there's a thing in it which has always struck me as so closely related to my feeling about the Fourth Symphony. This text is all about hope, about utopia. The true genesis is not at the beginning, but at the end. Once the creative human has understood himself and that which is his, so there will arise in the world something that shines into everyone's childhood, but where no one has yet been, Heimat. That untranslatable German word which Homeland does nothing to, or very little to, replicate. So there's something about going back to childhood, retrieving, recapturing the essence of childhood. And you know, there's that famous thing about Picasso trying to find the child artist again in adult life. I think there's something about that going on in the Fourth Symphony. And I will leave you with that, hanging in the air like an angel disappearing into heaven. Thank you so much.